Welcome to the CEC Report for the 10th of April 2015. I'm Elisa Barwick, and joining me today is Craig Isherwood, CEC Leader. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Elisa.
And on today's show, last-minute rush to join Asian Infrastructure Bank builds momentum for new financial architecture. CEC conference sets agenda for Australia. And next financial crash always on their minds. So firstly, last-minute rush to join Asian Infrastructure Bank builds momentum for new financial architecture. CEC conference sets agenda for Australia. So on last week's show, Robert Barwick discussed a little about our international conference, which occurred on March 28th to the 29th and included international guests from BRICS nations, and we'll come to a bit more detail on that in a moment. But during that weekend, there was a last-minute rush of various nations across the globe joining the AIIB. The estimates are, and for example, if you see this map which comes from Wikipedia, they list 59 nations. Most people are saying around 50, but they actually list 59 nations that have applied to become founding members of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Now, some of those countries have been approved and some of them are under consideration and have not yet been approved. Australia, for one, is still waiting for approval, but at the same time, we've put our own contingencies, as we mentioned last week, upon joining. Now, if you look at this map and consider the fact that already China has very significant agreements already to build infrastructure in various African countries, because most of Africa is not a part of that AIIB at this stage, but also that China has a lot of agreements also to work on infrastructure projects in South American countries. You can see the extent, it is obvious the extent to which the entire world, barring countries like the United States at this stage, really want a major change in the entire framework, both the economic and financial architecture, but also in the security architecture. So this has an incredible momentum and it will take off. And just before we talk a little bit more about some of the updates that are occurring and the movement occurring within the BRICS and these other financial institutions, I wanted to put a finer point on the necessity to do this with the greatest urgency, because again we see yet another war drive, like we've seen in Ukraine and in various other parts of the world, to bust up the kind of alliances that are growing out of the BRICS and their collaborators. This time it's coming out of Yemen, and people have been no doubt hearing about this on the news, but to give a bit of the background, the Saudis, of course, are bombing a group in Yemen called the Houthis and their allies with the support of the US, which are increasing their shipments of weapons now to Saudi Arabia, and with the support of the United Kingdom.
And there's even talk about Saudi Arabia getting nuclear weapons now, with its collaboration with Pakistan and so forth.
Yeah, that's right. So this is a great worry, but you know, to see what's going on here, as we've seen in various other cases, and the real paradoxes here. The Houthis that these guys are bombing have been the most effective forces in fighting and putting back the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda in Yemen. So, and the other interesting thing is that these strikes began just as the P5+1 negotiations with Iran were being finalised, and of course Saudi Arabia and Israel were very open in their opposition to those agreements, and they are willing clearly to create a regional war to stop that kind of resolution with Iran and to allow Iran to come into, and it's a country that is very interested, I might add, in being part of the larger and broader BRICS process. That's what you see going on, and just in this morning's news you have had John Kerry having some things to say about it. The US has accused Iran now of directly aiding the Houthi rebels, and Kerry said that Iran needs to recognise that the United States is not going to stand by while the region is destabilised. So you really see how this can blow up in a major way and very, very rapidly.
I was just about to say, Elisa, this is typical of what you see when the global financial system is crashing. You see all these nations, 59 plus nations, are now looking towards a new financial architecture because they can see the fact that since the 2007 global financial crisis, nothing has changed. The debt bubble's got much bigger, and we can talk about that further in the program. But the impulse of many countries is just saying we want to survive, we want to no longer go down the World Bank, the IMF conditionalities road, which in history has seen the decimation of countries historically. If you look at South America, for example, these countries are saying no. We want to go with the idea of sovereign economic development. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank represents this new paradigm. So this is a real threat to the West, to the collapsing transatlantic system. And as is always the case, whenever you get the threat of a new system coming up, the initial trigger is always to go to war. And I think what you see with the BRICS countries, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. There's 5 countries there. We just had the whole conference on this subject. They are forming a peaceful alliance for mutual cooperation, but also regional security. Their attitude to security is that you have to have sovereign nation states collaborating, not wars. So this is representing a new force in the political structures in the world today, and it's really quite amazing to see that the BRICS is just not about finance. It's about all sorts of things. Cyber terrorism, they want to deal with that. They want to deal with the international drug trade. They want regional security. They want new financial development based upon sovereign nation states. So this is what's under attack here. It's not just there's some new financial architecture, but this entire new approach to state relations.
And a good example of that was the Chinese envoy to the Middle East, who's in Israel at the moment, and he just made the point that any future solutions for peace in the Middle East should not only include the written peace agreements, but must include economic recovery and development. And he said that only that kind of approach can push forward the peace process to actually create a lasting breakthrough so that we're not just back at the drawing board 5 minutes later.
Well, that's where the problem comes in, because look, if we go back to 1990s, the beginning of the Iraq War, right? What we've created is a generation of young people who know nothing but war.
That's right.
We have to break the psychology of war and the damage that's done from war by actually having a war of peace. Let peace become the actual dynamic. Let's not have any more of these wars for the destruction, but let's fight for peace.
And I think that's exactly why you see the momentum sweeping with the AIIB, because nations are just sick of this and they want to work together for what is in their mutual benefit. So just to give a few of the updates on that BRICS process and how that's blossoming, you had over the same weekend as our conference the Boao Forum, which occurred in China. And the Chinese launched their plan for the One Belt, One Road idea to build the Eurasian land bridge, which was called Visions and Actions on Jointly Building Belt and Road. And so that laid out a whole series of development corridors, including transportation, trade, energy infrastructure, new industries, science centres, cross-border economic and investment zones. There was an extraordinary speech by Xi Jinping, which you can read some very compelling excerpts of in our Australian Alert Service, so call in and we'll send you a free copy of that, because I think anyone who were to read the comments of Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, any Australian who saw that would not be afraid of China's intentions in this region, including on the war front, because, we've had this rhetoric for a long time that China wants to, contain the region and control the region. But Xi said at one point, just as an example of this, he said the Chinese nation loves peace and has since ancient times held high such philosophies that harmony is the most valuable, peace and harmony should prevail, and that all men under heaven are brothers. China has suffered from turbulence and war for more than a century since modern times, and the Chinese people would never want to inflict the same tragedy on other countries or peoples. And there were many Australians at this event, Craig, including the Finance Minister, Matthias Cormann, the Governor-General, Peter Cosgrove, Bill Shorten, etc. So I think this kind of level and quality of discussion would have hit them quite hard if it even registered with them.
Well, it would create a paradox for them, because this is not the system that these guys are pushing. I mean, we're so entrenched in the British Empire, which is what it still is. It's called the Commonwealth now, but this idea of, there's a dynamic that's the zero
sum game.
Zero-sum game idea of the British, right, is the ruling ideology. That is that there always has to be a winner and there always has to be a loser.
As opposed to this win-win idea that China's putting forward.
Yeah, so the point is that you've got a complete dichotomy of method here. The British method versus the old Confucianism embedded idea embedded into China.
And Putin at the same time made a speech because Russia is taking the leadership of the BRICS now in the lead up to the UFA summit in July, and he also said that we are going to take the BRICS partnership to a new higher level. So there's other things in store there. But we're going to stop for a moment now, and when we come back we'll talk more about our international conference of the CEC and how that intersects this. Welcome back to the CEC Report. So we're talking about the momentum towards a new international financial architecture, and we're now going to talk in a bit more detail than we did last week about our international conference held by the CEC on March 28th to 29th. Now that conference was called the World Land Bridge, Peace on Earth, Goodwill Towards All Men. And I'll get you to talk more about it, Craig, but first I'll just introduce who our various prominent speakers were, and there's too many to mention them all by name. But Helga Zepp-LaRouche keynoted the conference, and she, of course, is the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute and is widely known across Eurasia as the Silk Road Lady. We had two very important Russian guests. One was Professor Georgy Tolereya, who's the Executive Director of the Russian National Committee on BRICS Research. And we also had Dr. Alexei Muraviev, the head of the Department of Social Sciences and International Studies and Coordinator of International Relations and National Security Programs from Curtin University in Perth. Now, speaking by pre-recorded video message from the United Kingdom, we also had three members of Parliament, two Labor MPs and senior MPs, Michael Meacher from the House of Commons and Jeremy Corbyn from the House of Commons also, as well as Robert Olds, who's in the Conservative Party and is the director of the Bruges Group. Now, in addition, we had a speaker from Ukraine, also by pre-recorded message, Dr. Natalia Vitrenko, former Member of Parliament and leader of the Progressive Socialist Party of Ukraine, who's been outspoken against the Nazi takeover of the new coup-led government there. And we had from South Africa a collaborator of ours, the leader of the LaRouche movement in South Africa, Philip Sokolabani, and our regular viewers would have seen him interviewed on the show last week. So this conference had and will continue to have very profound both international as well as national ramifications, particularly as we continue to circulate the presentations, and people should definitely visit our conference webpage, which you'll see up on the screen, because all the videos of those presentations, most of which are quite short, 20 or 30 minutes, are available for viewing, as well as most of the transcripts already being posted. But just from the viewpoint of some of our international guests, one of those international speakers observed that this was a very important milestone conference, and he said that it was of an international standard, both the speakers and the audience. This is a real coup to have pulled this together, basically. And he was extremely happy both that there is such interest in Australia, in the BRICS, and also very interested in the prospect that Australia might align with the BRICS as an observer or a partner at some point. And another of the guest speakers was really shocked at the depth that we went into. He's used to government kind of conferences which don't go into such depth, and also at the level of concentration and of commitment from the audience.
I think this is the intention of our conference, right from the word go, Elisa, sort of stems from our last new citizen. Australia, UK must join the BRICS, and we've put out hundreds of thousands of these newspapers we've published and sent around to the UK in particular. We actually posted out thousands of this newspaper and also of our magazine on the question of BRICS versus terrorism, and we got some tremendous responses from the UK in terms of some parliamentarians there. But the intention of this conference was to explore this idea of Australia joining the BRICS. And during the conference, we got word that Australia was signing a memorandum to look towards joining the AIIB. So that was a very interesting development during the conference. I think that this is really, we discovered that you can't just simply say, oh, I want to join the BRICS. Dr. Toloreo made that very clear. He said, look, there's 5 founding countries here, and we're developing this alliance, and we don't want to have other countries come in and wreck it. So they're very. And this is not about. This is not geopolitical, zero-sum game politics here. We're talking about mutual collaboration. We're talking about mutual respect. We're talking about national sovereignty. All the things that currently under the IMF, World Bank / British-run imperial system is not recognised. So we were able to bring this into Australia. We're able to give people a real sense of what the BRICS means. That's why people should get on the website, listen to these Russian speakers about what is actually being talked about, because our Western media is blocking this out completely. In fact, in some cases, other embassies have no idea what the BRICS represents, because it's just not something that at this stage Australia is really serious about looking at. Look at the fight we've had with the Australian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Right, well, the BRICS is the next stage of that as well, because it's not just, as I said before, not just investment and banking. This is about regional and sovereign collaboration amongst nation states, which is a big change to the sorts of policies that we've seen pushed down our throats by the British.
Yeah, and I want to raise Glass-Steagall as well, because there's a real prospect that Glass-Steagall can come onto the horizon because of these forces that are aligning to create a new financial architecture, because it's obvious that we need to rein in the banks as a first step in that. And all the 3 UK parliamentarians that spoke to our conference,
and they're on the website so people can watch them.
Yeah. All spoke in favour of Glass-Steagall. So this is from both major parties, and one of them called for a European-wide collaboration to get Glass-Steagall. But it's also worth mentioning that the coming election in the UK in early May could prove decisive in consolidating a pro-Glass-Steagall anti-austerity coalition. There are sweeping moves against the Conservative Party, against David Cameron, and the prospect of the Labor Party forming a, maybe not a formal coalition, but voting agreements and so forth as a bloc with the Scottish National Party. And this is forming as very much opposed to the current austerity.
And for our new viewers who happen to be watching, Glass-Steagall is actually new legislation necessary in every country and globally to separate out the existing necessary commercial banking system that people use for everyday commerce from the investment merchant banking. Separate the two so that you don't have a huge speculative debt-ridden banking system that you control the too big to fail banks and so forth. So this is what's being called for here.
And there's a big block of support in the UK Parliament, because it did come up, full Glass-Steagall, not just some halfway measure, came up in 2013, and it was only narrowly defeated by 9 votes in the House of Lords and by fewer than 50 votes in the 650-member House of Commons. And I think that this can have a big impact on our members of Parliament here, even the debate on it, because they either align with or at least closely follow what's occurring over there, of course, for better or worse. Now, I'll just also mention before we break that in the US, apparently in the last week, there was a secret meeting which involved some of the major Wall Street banks, including Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan and Citigroup, to discuss withholding campaign financing from some of the pro-Glass-Steagall candidates there, such as Elizabeth Warren, who's campaigned tirelessly for Glass-Steagall, but also, as we've mentioned on the show before, the pro-Glass-Steagall likely presidential candidate Martin O'Malley. So that's another thing to keep your eye on. So we'll stop there and be back in a moment to discuss more of what Australia's up to. Welcome back to the CEC Report, and now we'll discuss next financial crisis always on their minds. So as much as our leaders can, try to give the impression that, they're not concerned about another financial crisis, that everything's fine, despite, short-term budget questions and so forth, it is on their minds, as we'll show you briefly. Now, just to situate it, there has been a major article that warned about a new oncoming crash, as there has been a few that we've reported. And this came out in the London Telegraph of the 23rd of March, which was headlined, "The World's Next Credit Crunch Could Make 2008 Look Like a Hiccup." And basically the article asserts that if the Federal Reserve in the US were to raise interest rates as they're considering, that this could wipe out nearly a fifth of the tangible book value of European banks. And of course that would just be the beginning point for a financial nuclear chain reaction. And the article goes on to say that the banks are well aware of this problem, but they're dealing with it because they're hedging by using derivatives. Although the author goes on to say that derivatives work only as long as they're not needed.
That's right.
Calling them into action renders them useless.
And you've got 27 trillion of these things on the Australian banks.
Yeah.
Not on their balance sheets, off their balance sheets that have been sort of hidden away, saying that these things really don't matter, they're not important, and so forth. But when there is a correction of some magnitude, it's unknown how these weapons of mass destruction, as Warren Buffett called them, would actually work.
Exactly, and it's very notable that the rate of increase of our derivatives has been increasing at near to $1 trillion a quarter, or even some quarters in the recent 4 or 5 quarters by $1 trillion or more.
That's the entire GDP of Australia.
Exactly. So what's going on here? And you think about the exposure we've often noted that Australian banks have to the housing bubble. And for one thing, in the last period, there's been a massive collapse of housing values in the former areas that were in mining boom. And of course, once the mining boom collapsed and people moved out of those areas, you've got houses that were sold for millions of dollars plus that are now down to $200,000 or $300,000.
Typical of the bust cycle. I mean, because the price of iron ore has gone from $120 at the peak of the boom down to hovering around the $50 a tonne mark, which is meaning that a number of mining companies, what they call the high-cost mining companies, are literally shutting their doors. They're just mothballing mines. There's only 2 or 3 mining companies left now that can actually produce iron ore at less than $50 a tonne, which is really quite staggering when you think about the number of people that have been employed in that sector.
And you know also that this is on Joe Hockey's mind, because he's now, for the next coming budget, calling for the original Labor Party idea of imposing a deposit levy in order to guarantee the bank deposit guarantee, which is supposedly already there, but now we have to impose a 0.05% tax on bank deposits in order to ensure that we can guarantee your deposits if there would be a financial crisis in the future.
But see, that only raises $500 million, Elisa, and the deposits in these banks that are so-called insured are $700 billion.
Yep.
So you're talking about a fraction of the money raised. Look, this is just a tax, again, to cover the shortfalls that the government finds itself in. Without a full Glass-Steagall banking separation and a re-regulation of the banking system, there is no solution here. And anyone that looks at the problems will realise that is the problem. But as you mentioned before, because of the hysteria about US presidential candidates, particularly campaigning for Glass-Steagall, the big banks are saying, oh no, don't cut off our lifeblood of speculation, we're not going to survive. We can't fund these candidates. You see the sort of hysteria that there is actually behind the scenes in these sorts of matters, which we go through quite a bit in our Australian Alert Service every week too.
Yeah, exactly, and you can get a copy of that by calling in. So that's all we have time to discuss this week. Thanks, Craig.
You're welcome.
And thanks for tuning in. Go to our website, check out those videos, and join us again next week for the CEC Report.